In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I made this animated character cake that has a couple of 3D elements on it as well, including the hat and hair and such. My Lily was turning 15 and I found this really cute animated picture online that looked just like her, and I thought it'd be really fun to put this onto a cake. So I went for it. Okay, I am using a dummy here to help me just kind of get the right size of how tall this cake should be, how tall I want it to be. So this cake, I want it to be about 8 inches tall, between 7 and 8 inches tall, because I want to be able to get this face nice and big on the side of the cake, covering the whole side of the cake. And I wanted it to be about 8 inches tall, right? So I need my base cake to be about 8 inches tall, which means it's going to be a double barrel in order to get this face nicely on the side of the cake to look nice and all of that. We're going to have to create a double barrel cake, which is basically two tiers stacked on top of each other that are the same in diameter. And we also are going to need to figure out how to create the brim of this hat here to match up with this picture. So I actually have this template of a hat brim, and both of these pictures and all other inspiration pictures could be found in the post, this tutorial post below in the picture section. And you're going to want to print out this template to fit basically this girl's hat, right? So you're going to want to print out your girl's face first to the height that you want her to be and how you want her to fit on the side of the cake. Then you have to measure the brim of her hat on that picture, and that is how wide the brim of your template should be. Mine ends up being 5¼ inches wide, and then you print out that template to that size. I use Google Docs. You could use whatever you want in order to do that. Okay, so to make the brim of the hat, we're going to start with that first because it's going to need time to dry. I am using gum paste and I'm adding a little Tylose powder to the gum paste. I'm using satinized gum paste, which dries nice and hard. We want this to dry very, very hard for us, but if I add a little bit of Tylose to my gum paste, and I don't ever really measure it out, I just kind of add. That's probably about a tablespoon, maybe a little bit less. To this handful of gum paste, it will help it to dry even harder for me more quickly. And that's what I'm going for here because we really need this brim to be nice and hard by the time we add it to our cake. Make the brim, a day or two ahead of time. A couple days I recommend, and that will be good for you. Okay, I'm using a little acupuncture needle to get out any air bubbles in my gum paste as I'm rolling it out. And I don't want to roll this out too thin because it is the brim of a hat, right? So probably 1/4 inch thick is a good thickness, maybe a tiny bit less. And I'm putting my template that I printed out over top of the piece of gum paste I rolled out. And I'm using the back of a paintbrush. It's got this little beveled edge. You could use whatever you want, a Dresden tool, anything that will work, the back of a scalpel. And I'm just tracing the outline of the brim through the paper, just running over it, pushing down firmly so that those lines can be seen on my gum paste underneath. And then I'm going to use my scalpel and I'm going to cut that out. If your gum paste is moving around on you on your board, just use a little shortening to keep it attached to your work surface there for you so you can cut it out nicely. Okay, and then just using my fingers to kind of shape it up, get it back into shape. Now, this is not going to be perfect. I'm actually going to end up having to cut this down several times, but this is just a guideline to start, okay, so that I know where to start. But I can easily cut this down later on. So not to worry if it's not perfect to start. Now I'm using my dummy to kind of shape this brim around it because my cake is going to be generally the same size. Again, we will cut it down as needed later on. But I want it to dry, so I'm placing it on a board. I'm using cans to keep the dummy from rolling. And this is how I'm going to let this brim dry and get nice and stiff for us. I'm just going to kind of put it on to this dummy as if it was going to be placed on the cake. I'm going to use some paper towels to help hold it up and whatever else I need. I'm probably going to use a little jar here. Yeah, the Tylose jar and a paper towel. Hold it in place and let it dry like that for a day or two before I attach it to the cake. Okay, now to build the cake. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to need this to be about 8 inches tall, which means I need to create a double barrel here. All right, so this is one tier, which is 5.5 inches tall that I've built so far. And I've got my support straws in it. If you need to find out how to do that, go to the fundamentals course on Cakeheads, which is free, and that will show you how to properly stack your cakes. But I've got 4 support straws in it cut to the right height. And now I've got another 6-inch cake card because we're basically going to be putting another 6-inch cake tier on top of this one. But I'm cutting down around the edges so that it doesn't get in the way of me icing this cake as one cake all together once it's time to do that. And I'm placing that on top of my support straws. And now I'm going to add some buttercream on top of that. And I'm going to build the rest of my cake on top of that. So this is 5.5 inches, so we only need a couple more inches to get it up to 8 inches. So I'm just adding a couple more layers with my buttercream as my filling, and then I'm going to measure, and this gives me about the height I need. Okay, so this is just one way to create a double barrel cake, which is just a really tall cake basically, with some support in the middle so it doesn't push down on itself. Okay, that's 8 inches tall total. Now I have covered it with ganache. Again, go to the fundamentals course on Cakeheads if you need to see any of these basics and how I do that. It's nice and easy, but I've covered it as one with ganache, and I put that in the fridge to chill so it's nice and hard shell. And now I'm adding my fondant, rolled my fondant out, and I'm making sure that top is secured with no air bubbles underneath there. And now I'm getting the top edges nice and secure, and I'm going to keep opening up these pleats and smoothing down so I get a nice good fondant covering. I'm using Karma Masa fondant here, which is my very favorite. It's definitely expensive here in the States, but it is amazing and it never gives me any trouble. And especially when I'm covering a double barrel cake or a very tall cake, I always use Karma whenever I can because it's just hardly any hassle at all. Again, check out the fundamentals course if you need some refreshers on how to cover a cake with fondant well. Okay, so now I've got it down to the bottom there. I'm going to shape it up in a minute, but I want to get rid of my excess fondant. The trick, again, to covering in fondant is just keep opening those pleats over and over again and smoothing, and you'll be okay. All right. It does get a little thin sometimes, the bottom of a double barrel, because it's such a tall cake, but it's fine. I use my smoothers when I am done covering it like so to just smooth it, get it all into shape, get out any imperfections, a little powdered sugar because it's summer and that my cake was chilled, and so it starts to get a little sticky, so I'm constantly using a lot of powdered sugar to help me. And then so these pink smoothers I got from Shireen's Cakes and Bakes. They're my very favorite smoothers. I'll have a link in the post below if you want to check them out. She's in the UK, but I love, love, love them so much, especially this round one. You can see how I use it to help me cut the bottom of the cake. I just kind of hold it against the side and push down and do that all the way around the bottom. Okay, now I am moving my cake to its board. You're going to want to use some royal icing or some, you could use piping gel if you want in the summer. You could use ganache. Just stick it to the board so it does not move on you. Okay, that's the cake. Put it in the freezer to get nice and chill while we move on. Okay, now I am going to cut out my girl's face. How do I create this animated character? For me, this is the easiest way to do it. It takes out all the guessing of how to create her face and is really a good guide whenever I want to do something like this. So I've got another piece of gum paste here, and I've rolled it out to about 1/4 inch thick. And I got it nice and smooth. I'm going to tape my picture over top of the gum paste. I've done this in several videos, some of them free, some of them not. I have a very extensive tutorial like this called the Halo tutorial on Cakeheads if you want to check that out. But this one's more of a simple version. And what I'm going to do is use that same beveled edge on the back of my paintbrush, but really you could use whatever works for you here. And I'm tracing. I'm tracing the outline of the hat onto this gum paste. So I'm pushing through the paper and I'm pushing down hard enough so that I'm going to be able to see all these lines that I'm tracing once I take this paper off of the gum paste. I'm going to see them in the gum paste, and those are going to be my guides to creating her. So you do have to make sure you get these pushed down nice and firmly, not pushing through your paper. That's why I love this beveled edge of this paintbrush here, because it works beautifully for this. But I'm tracing all around her face, around her shoulders. You saw me tracing down there. And then I'm tracing her eyes. I'm going to be tracing her eyelashes. Anything that I'm going to want to use as a guide once I take this paper off to help me paint her and color her afterwards. I'm tracing the inside of the eyes, the pupil, the iris, because she's got brown eyes and then a really large black pupil, even around the little whites, the highlighted parts of the eyes, anything that I'm going to want to know exactly where it is on my piece that I'm working on afterwards. The lips, all the little details I'm going to be using as a guide to painting. So the eyebrows, I want to know exactly where they're supposed to be on my picture, and so I'm going to trace them all. Okay, even this, you can see the little bridge of her nose here. Lightly, I'm going to lightly trace those just so I have a guide later on of where the coloring should go for that. And then the top of her t-shirt, the outline of her hair, just the outline of it, because we're going to be adding hair on afterwards, but we do want that outline there. Okay, so then I take my paper off and I can see all of my lines. The eyes look a little bit like a jumbled mess, but that's okay because you'll be able to figure out as you go what those lines are for. Okay, right? Remembering what color goes where, we'll be able to figure that out. Now I'm just kind of finishing the top of her hat because my inspiration picture did not have this curve, the top curve of her hat. It was kind of cut off. So I'm just kind of adding that where I think it should go by connecting the two sides that I traced. And then we are going to be cutting out just the outline of everything that we traced around the top of her hat and around the sides of her hair. That's all we're going to be cutting out because we're going to be painting, coloring, filling in the rest. And this is basically kind of the gum paste plaque base that we're going to be putting onto our cake when we are done with it. And then I'm just kind of measuring how tall it needs to be and then cutting a nice bottom straight edge down below. All right, now for coloring, I'm using a Baker Pan edible food coloring marker to start. I really like this particular brand of edible marker. It works really well. It's not easy, it's not hard to use. Some of them can be a little hard to use. They don't show up really well. But this one is pretty great and it's got a nice fine tip. And so I'm starting off by just lightly and carefully tracing the outline of her chin. And then I'm going to trace the outline of her eye, including her eyelashes. A lot of this, you're just going to kind of have to watch where I trace to get the gist of what I'm doing. But you can see my lines are not perfect, right? So don't worry about being perfect with this because in the end it will come together. You do want to be as careful as possible, but it's not the end of the world if some of your lines get messed up. So I'm just generally looking at my picture here and all the places that are dark and need a dark outline. And I'm going to be filling in the eyelashes here. I filled in the eyebrows. And we are going to be going over a lot of the black here later with paint because when we add dusts and stuff, they're going to lighten up on us a little bit. So it's okay to not get them perfect right now. We can go back over this later on. Okay, so the bottom eyelashes, I filled those in. And I traced around the highlights in her eyes as well. Now for the neck, the top of the t-shirt, around the shoulders, And of course, do that with both eyes. Now, I haven't gone to the nose or the lips yet because those are very delicate. They're not as dark, and so we're just going to save those for later, okay? Now I have some edible art paints. You can use any edible paint you want. You can create your own edible paint. There's lots of ways to do that. I love edible art paint, so I'm going to use that. They give you really nice coverage, and I'm going to use that to fill in the pupils of her eye, which are rather large. You know, in animated characters, they like to make the pupils nice and big. And so that's going to be the inside. And then you'll see a rim around it. That's going to be the brown, right, that we see in the picture. And then you leave those little highlighted white highlights without any color. Okay, so do that for both eyes. And now I'm moving to brown. Again, you can create your own paints with dusts and vodka or Everclear, or even cocoa, raw cocoa butter, and petal dust. You can create paints that way as well. If you check out my Maleficent tutorial, which is free on Cakeheads, it's a quick one, but it shows you how to use cocoa butter for painting if you want to go that route. That's a cool way to do it as well. I know edible art paints can be expensive to get, but they're definitely worth it because they're nice and easy to use when painting something like this. All right, so I'm being careful and just painting the brown rim around the black in the eyes. Okay, so we've got the inside of the eyes painted so far. Now we are going to petal dust. Now you do want to let that dry. I didn't let that dry, and you'll see me run into problems because my black smears a little bit. Before you do this part, you want to let this dry. But I'm using flesh tone petal dust here. I definitely recommend this color. I use it all the time. And I'm using a brush. It's not super pointy, fine tipped, but it is relatively small, slightly fluffy. I have a ton of brushes, which I highly recommend because you always need a different kind of brush for different kinds of application. Okay, so I'm taking this petal dust and I'm just kind of adding it on. We're going to be using our fingers like a real, not a real painting, but a real drawing to kind of blend and smudge in and such. But it might be a good idea to put some powdered sugar before you start painting this gum paste plaque. You want to make sure that it's dried out and it's not moist in any areas to kind of catch the petal dust and make it blotchy. You want it to be a little bit dried out. Not totally dry, but a little bit dried. And you can do that by adding some powdered sugar over top of the whole piece of gum paste before you start any painting or any of this. And just kind of rub it in. See, you can see there where I smudged my black. And I just used a little bit of vodka and a paper towel to try, and a little paintbrush to get some vodka on there, and then dab with the paper towel to try to get rid of the black that I smudged. And this was about the best I could do in order to do that. But I just wanted to show you that in case that happens to you. But I'm just taking basically this petal dust, this flesh tone petal dust, and I'm starting my first layer of color by putting it on and using my finger, putting it in the areas that I see it in my inspiration picture. Right now, if you'll notice, around her cheeks, it's very light. There isn't any, I don't put any flesh tone there because that's kind of, her hat is making most of her face a little bit darker, but around her cheeks, it's light, like light is shining on her face in that area. So I want to leave that without any color on it. Okay, so just you really want to pay attention to your inspiration picture. Where do you see the flesh tone color? And that's where you add it on your piece. I always say when doing this, you have to pay attention to the colors and where they are. You have to forget that it's a face or it's an object, and you just have to break it down into colors and placement of colors, tones, shades, and where are they. Get it out of your mind that you're making a face because that could screw you up, and just start paying attention to the colors and exactly where they are. And in the end, it all comes together. Okay, so I'm just getting the flesh tone on there and I'm using my finger to blend it all in together so it's not blotchy. Make sure your finger is nice and dry. Get some powdered sugar on your finger if it's not. And you don't have to use your finger if you don't want to. And if this is for a customer and they're going to be eating this girl, which I don't recommend, it is gum paste, but they could, then you can use food safe gloves if that works for you, however you want to do it. Okay, now see on the inspiration picture, I started with flesh tone, but it's not quite the right color. It's just the base. We need another color to layer over top of this. So I have this wafer palette, Petal Dust palette, and you can see there it's like a warm. I just showed you the color. If you want to rewind and see it, there it is again. It's like a pinkish, fleshy color. Now I'm using that and I'm just kind of rubbing some onto my fingers and then rubbing over top of where I see it on my inspiration picture. And it's going to be kind of centralized on the upper part of her face again. Because remember, the light is shining where the hat brim is not shading her face, the light is shining on her area around her mouth. So we're going to leave that nice and light, and we're going to fill in around her eyes here. We're going to start creating that brim of the nose with our fingers the way we shade in here. So keep that in mind. We definitely need to get good color on the top of her nose there. This is where we start to really define her facial features, the way that we add our petal dust in here. I'm using my brush to kind of just define that color a little bit more so I can get the bridge of her nose look going on here. And I don't want to rub that black again on her eye because it's not totally dry. That's another reason why I'm using the brush to help me get that color on there rather than just my full finger. And then underneath the eyes there, on the sides of the face, anywhere on my picture where I see this pinkish color. And wherever it's darker, then I need to add more. I need to darken it up a little bit. We are going to be using some gray and black as well to help get more shading in. So don't worry about it if you can't, can't get it super dark because we are going to be darkening it up a little bit more. But this really helps us get that color that you see on the inspiration picture there, layering it, starting with the flesh tone and going with this peachy color. Okay, this is this is the same color that we were using before, but we're just adding a little bit more in areas where it's a little bit darker to help define the nose here. Okay, so right next to the sides of the eyes there and right on the tip of the nose. Again, this wafer petal dust thing that you see me using here, I love it because it's perfect for applications like this. It lasts a long time. It's super expensive. It'll be in the post below, but it's definitely worth it. And I've had it for years and years and never had to replace any of it. When it's got so many different shades of color in it, so it's really, really great for something like this. I use my flesh tone on her neck, and then I'm layering it with that same pinkish peachy color that we used on the face, but you'll notice it's darker right underneath her chin and then right by the top of her t-shirt line, and then it's lighter in the middle. Those are the things you want to pay attention to here. Okay, now you can see her ear in the inspiration picture, her ear on the right there, which is really her left ear. I'm just using my colors to fill that in. We're going to be adding hair around this, but I am going to leave that little section open so it'll look like you're looking at her ear there. Okay, now I'm moving to Dove Gray. And we're going to shade a little bit more just to get that look of the brim of her hat kind of hiding her face in shadow a tiny bit. So I'm just putting it on. That brim of the hat is going to be right up there, right above her eyebrows. So I'm just kind of rubbing it on there. So you can see I just put color on and then I'm blending it in with my finger. Again, make sure your finger is nice and dry when you do this. We don't want this petal dust color to get blotchy on us here. We'll be painting the hat later on, so just try and keep it clean if you can, but it's okay if it's not perfect. And rub it all in at the top there and then between her eyebrows and her eyelashes as well. You notice I'm dipping my paintbrush into the jar of petal dust, but then onto the lid when I want to control the amount of color a little bit better that I put on my picture. When you don't want too much color on and just a little bit, tap it onto the lid. You can tap it onto your paper towel. so that you don't get too much color onto your picture. Now I'm using that shadow to kind of help define the nose there. Pay attention on your picture. Where do you see the shadow on her nose? And that will help you get the bridge of the nose a little bit more defined again. Now around the top of her t-shirt and underneath her chin, notice I'm keeping the mouth area nice and light like I see in the picture. That is really going to help us in the end. Okay, now that looks pretty good to me, and now I just want to add a little bit of black just to darken it up a little bit more. Into the jar, onto the lid, so that I can control the amount of black that I'm putting onto the picture here. Putting a little bit on and blending it in. Definitely want to make sure those eyebrows are dry before you do any of this. And the black, I didn't want too much black on there, so I switched to cocoa. So you can see how it's very, very helpful to have lots of different shades to work with when doing a piece like this. The cocoa I am putting around the bridge of that nose and around the top of the eye, wherever I see again the shadows in my picture. That's where I'm putting it onto the picture that I'm creating as well, above her eyes, the top sides of her head. Where do I see the shadows in the picture? On the nose, really helping to define the nose, the side there where I see the shadow in the picture. Okay, underneath her chin again, and also the top edge of her shirt there. Okay, now I'm using my pinky to just kind of get a little bit more of that pink that we used earlier onto her nose and up near the top of her eyes, that same pink from before. Just keep going until I'm getting all the colors and tones that I see in my inspiration picture onto my picture. Using a little paintbrush to get a little bit more on her nose to define that nose a little bit more. Her neck, and using my fingers to blend. Okay, now the whites of the eyes are actually not white. Look at her mouth. That's white, but the eyes, because they're being shadowed by the brim of the hat, are actually gray. See, this is what I mean by get it out of your mind that they're eyes and so they need to be white, because they're not that in the picture, because light creates different colors on things. So now we just are adding a tiny bit of gray onto those whites so that they look like they're in shadow. And if you need a different, more defined paintbrush to help you with that, go ahead and do that. Make sure you don't have too much gray on your brush, just a little bit to gray them up. And that will help create the illusion that the brim is shadowing her eyes. Don't be afraid of adding the gray to her eyes. It needs to be that way because that's what the picture is showing us. Okay, now I'm switching back to paint because I'm going to go to the mouth here. I'm using baby pink edible art paint. So however you can mimic that color, if you don't have the edible art paint, do that. And it's light, it's really light. You want a light color for the lips. If you end up going with a dark color, she could easily turn into a circus clown look. Lips are, for me, I always like to try to keep them as light as possible, and then I can always darken them if it's a project in which I want her to have, very, very red lips. But start off with a light color. This picture, they're really light. She's a teenager. She doesn't have a ton of makeup on here, so that's why I went with the baby pink. And now I'm using my Baker Pan edible marker again, just for that one little line in between her lips. That's the only dark part of her lips. I'm not going to outline the lips altogether because I'm doing what I see in the picture, right? Now I've switched to a brown edible marker. This is, I think, Food Doodler set or Wilton set, but it's got a nice fine tip, and I'm creating the freckles that I see in the picture. Now my real life Lily has lots of freckles, so I ended up adding a lot more freckles than in the picture because I wanted to keep her. That's one of my Lily's defining characteristics, are those freckles. Now the nose, you can see what I did with the nose there. Very, very just gently, because that's what I see in the picture. I just made the little lines that I see on my picture for the nose. I didn't just draw a full out nose because that will ruin everything. Again, our mind sometimes tells us we should draw the nose, but no, we have to do what we see in the picture. Okay, and now I'm using Edible Art black paint to just go over the eye area and the eyelashes. Because of all the dust that we put on, it kind of dulled them, and I did want to make them nice and dark, bright dark. You know what I'm saying? Like a nice contrast, so they really popped out. And I did that with the eyebrows as well. And that is pretty much it for the coloring of the girl. Okay, so now I'm moving on to her hat. I'm using a stitching tool here. It usually comes in a fondant tool set to just follow the lines that I created earlier for the sides of where the color is going to end on her hat. I just thought that was a nice little touch. Not a big deal if you don't have one to use. Okay, so I'm going back to the brim of my hat now that's been drying for a day or two, and I'm just holding it up to my inspiration picture again now that it's dry to see how it's doing. And it's looking way too big for it. So this is kind of my first um, time that I'm cutting it down. I end up having to cut it down again later on, eventually when I hold it up to my cake. And that's okay because you can see I can easily cut through it because gum paste, while it is hardened now, it's still able to be cut without cracking. So it's not a big deal. So I'm just kind of trimming it with the scissors. I was holding it up to my inspiration picture and then again holding it up to the cake just to make sure it will sit nice and flush when I add it on. Make sure you're not cutting off too much because we do want it to still fit our picture. But you can just start trimming the first installment of trimming, and we'll get back to it again later on. Okay, so now I'm going to create her sweatshirt. I wanted, my Lily loves, or did at the time, again, this was like a year ago that I made this cake. She loved baseball hats and still loves hoodies to this day. So I wanted to create this picture. Instead of a t-shirt, I wanted to put on a hoodie. So I found another picture of the same sort of animated character and I printed it out to the same size, and this one has a hoodie on. So I'm doing the same technique I did with her face in order to cut that out. I rolled out a piece of red fondant actually this time, and I put my inspiration picture over that was printed out to the right size, and I am just tracing the hoodie in all the right spots so that I can cut it out. Again, exact same technique as I used to cut out her face. And I've got all my lines in there that I've traced that are my markers for where everything should be. I cut out the neck so that I can place this onto my gum paste plaque. And I'll use a little bit of water, or you could even use shortening to just kind of place it where it should be. And then, yeah, I'm using water here. You can place it. Because you printed out that picture to this exact same size as the picture of your inspiration girl plaque here, it works perfectly. And then I'm going to use a Dresden tool to there's my color shaper to just kind of fix up the bottom there. And I'm using my Dresden tool to just go over all the lines that I created when I was tracing this. And some lines I didn't create, I'm just kind of eyeballing it, looking at the picture as well, where I'm seeing lines in the sweatshirt picture that I used, because it looks like I didn't actually trace all those lines. But you can absolutely trace all those lines when you're tracing through the paper. But it's not hard to just kind of eyeball them for this, where I'm seeing the lines on my picture. That's where I'm putting them on my sweatshirt, creating the arms and just kind of the folds like you would see in a hoodie normally, and the gathers and all of that jazz. And then the little holes for where the strings usually come out in the hoodie as well. Okay, Now I am going to paint the top of the hat. I'm actually going to use this technique that Angela Morrison taught us in her live on cake heads. This is really cool and it worked out great. A very exciting technique because you don't have to create a paint. You can first put your alcohol, I'm using Everclear, on the area that you want to paint. Now, you do this when you're using metallics. I'm using a silver luster dust here, and so it works well when I'm using a luster dust. I'm adding the alcohol on. And I'm not being shy with the alcohol. I'm making sure it's nice and saturated, the gum paste, just in the area that I want to be silver, that I want to color. I'm actually going to go a little bit down and onto the top of her head here because I need silver there as well. The brim is going to go right over the eyebrow, so I'm going to go all the way down with my alcohol there and just make sure that all of the area that I want covered is nice and saturated with the alcohol. You could use a very high proof vodka. I used Everclear. Okay, now I've got my silver highlighter. This is not edible, by the way, so you should tell your customer, whoever is going to be eating this cake, to not eat this part. And I am just dusting on the highlighter over top of the alcohol. This is really an awesome way to get your highlighter on because it's not blotchy. It comes out beautifully as long as you put, enough alcohol on top. I'm just using a paintbrush and dabbing it into the jar and putting the luster on the edge with this little detail paintbrush because we want to get that line nice and crisp where the color ends. So I just do that for the edges, and I'll do that down below above her eyebrows in a minute. But for the main area that I need to have colored, I can then dab the luster dust over top of the alcohol and it just blends so beautifully. It's a great coverage and you don't have to paint it on because sometimes when you paint it on, it gets a little blotchy. And so this is one way of doing it where it doesn't get blotchy on you. That just the luster soaks into the alcohol and then gives you a beautiful finish. And I did the same thing with the brim here as well that was drying. I just used my paintbrush that had a little luster on it. That's why it looks the way it does when I was getting the alcohol on. But same idea, and it worked out beautifully. I love it. You can check out Angela Morrison's live she did with us on Cake Heads to see another way she uses that technique. Okay, so that's how I painted my hat. And you'll have to touch that up at the end of this and the brim as well. You'll see why. But for now, that's good. And now I'm using this disposable cloth that it's brand new and it's going to be thrown out and it's wet and it's damp. And I'm just rubbing it onto the side of the cake here to get the cake nice and sticky. That's one way to do it. A damp disposable cloth rubbing onto the fondant will get it nice and sticky. We don't want it slippery, we want it sticky so that we can paste our gum paste plaque onto it. Now, my plaque is not fully dry and that's okay. You don't want it to be too floppy on you or it's going to just be a hot mess, but you can see it's still bendy. It's not fully dry and that is totally fine to add it onto the cake like that. As long as it's stiff enough where it's going to hold, it's not going to totally crumple on you. And I'm just gently placing it onto the cake. Now, you don't have to push the sides all the way flat onto the cake if you don't want to. You definitely do not have to. It can pop off of the cake a little bit. I do that often with these kinds of projects. But you do want the middle to be pressed against the cake well. So I'm just kind of using a napkin here and folding it over and using my smoother to just press against the plaque and the middle of the plaque so that it is definitely attached to the cake well. Again, the sides don't have to be, but the middle you definitely want to be attached well. And now we're moving on to the hair. I'm using brown fondant. You can mix a little modeling chocolate in. You could just use straight modeling chocolate. Any of these will work fine. So I'm just kind of rolling out a little sausage shape that's tapered at one end. I rolled that in my hands and then I rolled it out on my surface a little bit flat with my little rolling pin. And now I'm using my Dresden tool to just score lines into it to make it look like hair. And I'm just kind of pushing at the ends there so that it looks like little pieces of hair rather than just, a blob of fondant. Really super easy technique. to create pieces of hair, like large pieces of hair. Now I'm using just a little bit of water. A little bit, we don't want it sopping, we just want it sticky. So a little bit with the paintbrush, and I'm going to first fill in kind of the back parts of her hair and then kind of layering it, right? So putting the back on, filling in this gap underneath her chin and her sweatshirt. And so you use your fingers to kind of create that shape, or you could use your pizza cutter or your scalpel, whatever, to just kind of create that shape and then push it in there and fill in that gap. And then you can use your Dresden tool over top of that again if you want to fix up your lines on that hair. Your color shaper to just kind of fit it in well and filling in those sections first. So here, yeah, I'm going to use my Dresden tool to just fix those lines, to define those lines a little bit more. And then you just kind of keep doing the same thing, create shapes. I got my next little piece here is going to go over top of that, and it's going to kind of be coming out of underneath the hat and out to the side. And then I just sort of arrange. Use a little bit of water to stick your pieces on and layer and just keep going until you get the look you want for the hair. Just remember to keep, the bottom pieces of the hair so that they actually look like the ends of the hair. Okay, so that's on the left hand side. I started right underneath the chin there and adding piece onto the side. So you have your the base gum paste plaque to add your hair onto. That's why we kind of kept it as wide as it is, so that we have a base to add the hair onto, especially if we didn't want to keep it flush with the cake. It helps it jut out a little bit and make it a little bit more 3D. And then you just keep going. Make sure that entire plaque is covered. You don't want to see any white underneath it. And you can just add as many pieces as you want. I was going to add another little piece here because the more layering you add, the more it looks like real hair. I wasn't totally happy with how my hair came out. I wanted it, I had a little bit of a different vision for it, but I figured it was good enough, ready to move on. Okay, so I'm holding my brim up now, and you see it's still too wide, and that's okay because we can just take our scissors and we can start cutting off the ends so that they fit the hat perfectly. Start with one end and go to the other end. Just start cutting just little amounts, nice and straight there, and then keep holding it up to the cake to check to see how it's fitting until you've got it just right. But cutting nice long pieces like that will help keep it nice and neat for you. And you just do that until it fits. Now we're not ready to add it quite yet. And of course, when you cut off the edges like that, you're going to have to paint them up at the end when you're all finished after you get the brim onto the actual cake. But you can do that later. That's no big deal. Okay, so I decided I wanted to add a little more hair, a little rope of hair underneath the hat that is going to help the brim of my hat to stay up. You don't really need to do this because later on I added something else that I'll show you to help keep the brim up. So you could skip this part if you want to, but I ended up doing it and it was fine. If I could do it over, I might put the brim of the hat a little bit lower and skip that little extra piece of hair right there. But I was just kind of doing this as I went along, and that was my idea to do it. But it can help hold up your brim for you a little bit if you put like, a thick rope of hair right there. But then I have these popsicle sticks, and this was actually perfect because they're thin but thick enough to be pushed into the cake through the gum paste plaque and into the cake, and my brim can rest upon these, and that way I don't have to worry about my brim falling off the side of my cake during delivery or anything like that. So this is definitely a trick that you want to use to help keep the brim up. And then I'm using melted candy melts right on the edge of the brim. Be careful, don't use too much because they will squish over and you'll have to get rid of them, just like you see right there. It's squished over, but that's okay. As long as I get to it quickly with a knife, I can scrape it off and you won't even see it. And then if you have some chef rubber Uh, yeah, Chef Rubber is a brand name. Magic Freeze Spray. You can spray that on there, and that will just harden up the candy melts for you, and your brim will just be on there perfectly. And so you can see now with those popsicle sticks, I didn't really need to add that rope of hair underneath because when you have a hat on, you don't really see bangs, underneath there. So I probably wouldn't do that if I could go back and do it again. But it's okay, it still worked. And that is holding my head up, so that worked beautifully. Now I just wanted to show you how to use these tappets. I wanted to put a 15 on her head. She was turning 15. I have actually a whole tutorial, separate tutorial, free tutorial showing how to use tappets because they can be kind of tricky. The idea is to roll your fondant or your gum paste really, really, really thin. I recommend gum paste. And using lots of powdered sugar on the tappets, on your gum paste, and pushing down and rubbing it against your work surface. And then as long as you use a ton of powdered sugar and you've rolled them really thin, you'll be able to smack the tappet onto your work surface and get those suckers out of that thing. But there's a whole other tutorial which I will include in this post to show you how to do that if you want more instruction on using those tappets. And then I'm just using shortening on, put it onto the back of the letters with a little paintbrush so that I can put these letters on and then move them around without messing up my project because the chances of you getting them on perfectly on your first shot are not very good. And if you use water, you're going to see watermarks if you try to move your pieces around. So using shortening is a really good way to get them on to your piece without messing things up. And then to finish off the cake, I rubbed some shortening onto the board as well. And I used Sprinkle Pop Draggies. Is that, I know that's not how you pronounce it, but you know me and pronunciation, just forgive me. Dragé. I don't remember. They're by Sprinkle Pop. Um, they're kind of like sugar pearls, only they're not technically edible. So just keep that in mind. And then she has these batons as well, these metallic batons. And because I used silver on the hat, I thought it'd be fun to use silver on the board as well. And that just gave the board a nice little touch without having to add fondant. And that was really fun. Another little thing I did for this cake is I used a sound card because Lily on her cell phone has this funny little voice message if she doesn't pick up and telling you to leave a message that she got from some movie, and it's kind of funny. So stacked ccc.com is a website you can go to buy one of these sound cards. They're really awesome. There's a live that Erin of Stacked did with us. Her and her boyfriend Joe creates these sound cards that you can use with cakes, and I'll include a link to that as well so you can watch that, and they tell you all about using them in that. And then also I created her name in lights, and I have a whole separate tutorial if you're a member of cakeheads.com to show you how to do that. Here's a sound card.
Hey, Lily, I'm chillaxing. Leave it at the beat.
And I ended up, you can actually add little feet to the bottom of your cake board, and then you can attach that underneath your cake board.
Hey, Lily, I'm chillaxing. Leave it at the beat.
That's her funny little message.
I'm chillaxing. Leave it at the beat.
Yeah. And so the sound card and the name in lights just really brought this cake, to life, and we had fun with it. So if you want to see how to make a name in lights topper, you can become a member of cakeheads.com. Join the Cakeheads family over there. We have a ton of fun together. Really love learning from each other and just hanging out online every day. And yeah, that's how I made the animated character cake. You could really adapt to just about any character inspiration photo you find online and use those techniques in order to create it onto your cake. I hope you enjoyed. See you later.